Everyone, welcome. Let's start the talk with Professor Clifford Bob, battling over LGBT rights at the UN, normative conflict and zombie policy. Professor Clifford Bob is Chair of Political Science in the Raymond J. Kelly Endowed Chair in International Relations. He holds a PhD in Political Science from MIT and a JD in Law from New York University. He has written several articles and academic books, including The Market of Rebellion, which was published by Cambridge University Press and won the International Studies Association Book of the Year Award. His book, The Global Right Wing and the Clash of the World Politics, won the ISA Book of the Decade Award in 2020. And his most recent book, Rights as Weapon, published in 2019 by Princeton University, as well. So he won fellowships from the Social Science Research Council, American Council of Learning Society, USIP, and the Transatlantic Academy. He currently holds a Fulbright Global Scholar Award to study conflict over COVID, lockdown policies in South Africa, India and Brazil, focusing on two issues: children's right to education and governmental efforts to control information about COVID. Thank you so much, Cliff, for being here. As we were just talking, your research has a lot of synergy with what a lot of us have been doing at PUC, and we're thrilled to have you and hear more about your own work.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Paula. I was actually very interested to hear from Paula and from talking to others here on the IRI staff that there are so many overlaps with some of the issues that I've been looking at for a number of years. And what I'm going to present today is some work that I've done a number of years ago that focuses on the conflict over LGBT rights, particularly at the UN. Although in the book from which this is drawn, I look at conflict over LGBT rights within countries as well. Let's look at how the international level, the UN and others at the international level, influence countries on their policies on these issues. And I look a lot at normative conflict, as I'm sure many of you are doing as well. And then this maybe unfamiliar concept, zombie policy, which basically suggests that some of the efforts to promote LGBT rights at the UN have not worked out as well as many, I think, of us would prefer. And my main hypothesis for why this is, in some ways fairly simple, namely that there is very, very strong opposition at the UN to the rise of LGBT rights. And I try to show in this, I'll show this presentation and in the book, just how that opposition actually works. So, that's actually sort of an outline of what my talk is. And as I said, it's based on this book that was published in 2012, which looked at conflict in the UN and also around the world, including this photo is taken from Uganda. Some of you may have heard of this infamous death to gays law that the Ugandan government put into law. And they were supported very strongly by various conservative religious groups, including some from the United States, like this man at the center here, on promoting that law. Not necessarily the idea that there would be a death penalty for LGBT, for homosexual activity, but instead that people should be punished, or at least that it should be prevented from happening. Anyway, this book looks at these issues within countries like Uganda, but also looks at the way in which LGBT rights have been promoted and attacked at the UN, and that is going to be the focus of my talk. My talk will attempt to first lay out very briefly global LGBT rights activism going back many decades at the UN, then look at what's less examined, the anti-LGBT rights activism at the UN. And then I'll talk about the, I'd say, rival theories that international relations scholars have used to understand these events. And I'll then go into a little bit more detail to try to demonstrate that the approach I'm going to propose is a good way to understand this kind of clash, as well as clashes over all types of other issues, rights-based issues particularly, at the UN. So to begin, and this is a very, very sketchy, but just gives you, I think, an idea of how LGBT rights activism progressed over the last few decades. It really began as early as the 1970s and 1980s with various specialized LGBT NGOs, including the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission and ILGA, probably the first of these, getting consultative status at the United Nations and trying to promote the rights of LGBT populations. They were supported early on by groups like the Ford Foundation, and actually the country of Holland actually was quite supportive, even back in the 1970s and 80s when this was an issue that was very, very much off the agenda more generally. By the 1990s and right up to today, that sort of marginalized status began to improve, at least among human rights, general purpose human rights NGOs. What might come as a surprise is that in the 80s, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International affirmatively rejected the promotion of LGBT rights at the UN. They said that that was some sort of political stance and they didn't want to get involved with it. But by the 1990s, they did take up the cause. So it was no longer these specialized, very small LGBT rights organizations that were promoting it, but also major human rights organizations. In addition, other liberal states became heavily involved, including Germany, Sweden, and to some extent Brazil as well. UN agencies became very much part of this, and you saw the formation of what I would call an LGBT rights network or coalition. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Kekin Sikking's book, which focuses on transnational advocacy networks. And I think this is a quintessential example of a transnational advocacy networks, which really became fairly large, fairly dense by the 1990s, and has continued to work very aggressively at the United Nations to promote a number of goals. I think most prominently, of course, is establishing some kind of international norm, or preferably in these activists' view, international law that would promote LGBT rights at the international level. So new human rights norms or even conventions. I'd say many of these groups also work very hard at the national level and to some extent bring in some of what they do at the international level. And I think if they were to achieve their goals fully, they would argue that let's say a human rights, an LGBT human rights convention would help promote LGBT rights in many domestic contexts. So in some ways, this story, which again is very abbreviated, I'm sorry about that, but it's a story that can be understood through what I would call the dominant international relations theory, kind of a normative politics approach, which I think many of us are familiar with, starting with the Kekin Sikking book in many ways, but with lots of other people who've contributed to it. And that dominant view focuses on what we could call left-wing activism. It highlights the way in which international norms and international activism can help create cascades that will make individual states more likely to adopt some of these rights issues. Often it states or suggests that what these analysts are looking at is the development of new, good, progressive rights. Rights that I think most of us probably would support, at least in this room, even if maybe not out on the street, who knows. But and there's a number of mechanisms that have been used or discussed by scholars, including a logic of appropriateness that would suggest that countries will start to develop these progressive ideas, progressive norms, because it is appropriate given the overall normative framework. I'd say there's a major focus in this kind of research on the cascade effect that often occurs when one state adopts a let's say in this case, LGBT rights agenda. The idea is that it will have an effect on other states. And at a certain point, at least in the language used by Sickink and Finnemore in a well-known article, there'll be a cascade of lots of new states that will start to adopt a new norm. Other mechanisms that are often talked about are these sort of spiral mechanisms in which there's a lot of interaction between the national and the international level, leading to this sort of virtuous circle of new norms developing. Although the literature doesn't look as much as I think it should at how these activist groups actually work internally, there is a focus on what I'd say network building, how especially the progressive groups build their coalitions of NGOs, how they construct issues as problems needing attention, how they activate institutions, that is how they come into, let's say, the United Nations and get certain bodies within the UN to act. And a lot of focus actually on the way in which persuasion occurs, how these activist groups frame their issues to make them more attractive to groups that might not otherwise support them. Sometimes grafting new types of issues onto existing norms. For instance, in this context, those who've studied from this perspective talk about the way in which LGBT rights were grafted onto already existing, already recognized women's rights, and how some of these LGBT rights activists came into very early women's rights conferences held by the United Nations in the 70s and 80s. There's a lot of emphasis as well on shaming states into changing their policies to make them adhere to international norms. And often there's a focus on how you would certify these norms by pointing to respected international authorities who in fact support them as well. So that's, I think, the way in which a lot of scholars would look at the rise, as they would call it, of LGBT rights at the international level, and certainly within domestic context as well. But there's another part of the story which I think a lot of us are now aware of. It was less familiar when I was doing this research, I think, which is now over a decade ago, but we have become more aware of this, I think. But it's always been around. It's been around for decades, almost as long, if not as long, as the pro-LGBT rights agenda. So these, I'm calling them the anti-LGBT rights activists. They include a number of key NGOs, states, and they formed their own network to try to oppose the LGBT rights agenda. In many ways, some of the first of them were Christian right groups, which we in the United States talk about as sort of evangelical, Protestant primarily groups. They were very active, as I suggested, in that Uganda case. But beyond just the traditional Christian right, you also see the Catholic Church, especially the Catholic Church hierarchy, very much involved with this. The Holy See has been very active in putting up roadblocks at the United Nations to the rise of LGBT rights. Muslim states, I have the Organization of the Islamic Conference here, also very, very active in trying to, you could say, torpedo the LGBT rights agenda at the United Nations. Now, when I was writing this book, I used the term batista-burqa coalition or network to refer to the fact that these in many ways are kind of strange bedfellows. If you understand, people understand that. It's a term we use in the United States and never know how much this idiom transfers. But anyway, strange bedfellows coalition, because often the Catholic Church doesn't work that well with evangelical Christians or with Muslims. So this was to suggest that these coalitions were really kind of coalitions of convenience. They didn't share underlying dogma, religious dogma at all, but they were willing to work with each other and did so very extensively. And I think all too effectively in many ways. And one thing that's developed in many ways since I wrote this book and published it in 2012 is the entry of Russia into this Batista-burqa coalition. So I'm calling it the batista-burqa-baboushka coalition these days to suggest that the Orthodox Church in Russia has become a key actor. And Vladimir Putin also, you know, as I'm sure many of you are aware, makes a lot of noises about the threat that the West poses to traditional values and to Russia. And he often points to LGBT rights for doing that. So in many ways, you know, might be a more appropriate terminology right now. So what are their goals? There we go. The goals of this Batista-burqa-baboushka coalition. Well, you could frame it very, you know, purely negatively, which is kind of the third thing I do. They're fighting LGBT rights. They are trying to prevent the rise of LGBT rights. They're trying to prevent even the concept of gender identity, sexual orientation and gender identity from being accepted or adopted at the United Nations. So they're, in that way, they're doing something that we could often see as sort of negative or blocking in a purely negative light. But they actually are arguing that they're doing this in a very affirmative way as well, that they are promoting something that they value, their goals of defending so-called natural families or promoting traditional values. That's definitely something that Putin talks about all the time these days. My general argument is that, you know, these activist networks on, we could say, the right, or I'll just call them the anti-LGBT rights activists in this case, have been very, very effective at it in the context of the UN in preventing the agenda that the LGBT rights activists want to promote from actually succeeding. So to switch over back really to the IR theory side of things here, I think that the current dominant views don't adequately address what I've just laid out here very briefly, and I'm going to go into more detail in just a second. And there's a number of ways that they, I'd say, fail to address what's actually happening rather than what we might want to happen. First of all, they generally have not paid much attention at all to right-wing activism. They have also, to the extent they've looked at this kind of issue, they will focus a lot at the international level. Right. We are IR scholars, so that's understandable, but they don't focus, I think, enough at the way in which national level politics influences what states do at the United Nations. By the way, just a piece of biography that Paula didn't bring up. I'm a former lawyer, so I am someone who actually practiced law. And as a practicing lawyer, we never did anything with norms. And so every time I hear people talk about norms in IR, I'm like scratching my head. What's a norm? What could you do with a norm? And so my focus has always been on what an actual law is, or maybe just a policy that a government puts out there, but especially laws, as opposed to norms. So that's essentially why I'm saying that the LGBT rights activists haven't really achieved what they would want, namely an international convention. But in it as well, I think we should get away from this concept of good versus bad, good and progressive norms on one side, because that flip side would suggest that what these anti-LGBT groups are doing is promoting bad norms or regressive norms. Now, I personally think that's right, but sort of from an objective standpoint as a scholar, I think it can sort of prejudice the way that you actually look at what these activists are doing. So I try to stay away from that. Rather than a logic of appropriateness, as the literature tends to focus on, I talk about a logic of conflict, and I'll show how that plays itself out. But I'll just, from a theoretical standpoint, what we often see is that these networks not only are trying to build themselves up add new NGOs to their international networks, but they're also taking actions to try to unbuild or deconstruct the other side's network. They're doing everything possible to weaken the other side, because to the extent they weaken the other side, then their side is going to win. And it's not just these, let's say, conservative groups that are doing this. It's also the progressive groups. They're both engaging in politics, where you not only promote one thing affirmatively, but you also engage, unfortunately, but realistically, in negative strategies against the other side. And one of them is trying to unbuild the other network. Another one is to, I call it, deconstruct the problem. You try to promote the idea that what one side says is a problem in need of a new policy or law is actually, that new policy or law is actually going to be the problem. And we need to oppose that. So they're deconstructing what the problem is, and they're creating new solutions. They're often trying to deactivate a institution that one side wants to use. And again, the literature has focused a lot on persuasion, but even while persuasion is taking place, there's also really its mirror opposite, dissuasion, various ways in which the activist groups are trying to dissuade others from joining their opponents. They're trying to change the frame or unframe an issue to make it less likely that their opponents will succeed in getting their goals. Instead of grafting onto existing norms, they're trying to split off those attempts. Often as well, instead of being shamed by the other side for something you've done, you honor your own side for having done that. In other words, shaming doesn't really transfer. If you have a totally different values, you can't really be shamed because you think you're doing the right thing. So we see a lot of this happening as well. And you often will attempt to undermine the authorities that one side is trying to use to certify their cause. Anyway, the upshot of this in terms of outcomes is that often we don't have new international law created. We don't have new international conventions, and that's the case in the LGBT rights area. Instead, you have what we call non-policy. In other words, nothing's done. Or what I'm calling zombie policy, where you might have something that's done at the international level, but it is basically devoid of life. It's empty. It doesn't have any real on-the-ground significance. Maybe it's symbolically important, at least to your own side, but it's kind of like the living dead of law and policy. And the way I explain that is by the conflict among these rival networks, the power of, I guess, in this case, like conservative networks, and especially the ways in which they sometimes tie themselves to powerful states. All right, so that's my alternative framework or theory, and what I'm going to do now is go into a little bit more detail about how this played itself out with regard to the LGBT rights conflict over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And this is not as up to date as it should be because it's based, again, on research I did about 10 years ago, if not more. But I think it'll give you an idea of the way in which this framework can apply and why we have, even to today, not seen the development of new international law in this area. So this clashing activism at the UN, or frankly at other types of international institutions, envelops every aspect of the activism. Most basically, it involves whether particular NGOs or networks are even permitted to participate in policymaking processes at the UN. So there's one example of how this has played itself out is the case of the International Lesbian and Gay Association, which was actually given UN consultative status, ECOSOC status, in 1993 to start promoting its LGBT rights agenda. And that was a big success. But almost immediately, the anti-LGBT network began to try to find ways to kick ILGA out of the UN, to end its participation. They weren't even debating the issues, really. All they were trying to do at the threshold was get this group from even being part of the conversation. And I'd say this is a major tactic that often both sides to these conflicts use. I'll show you another example from the other side in a moment. So what happened? In 1994, 1 year later, there was a campaign by Christian right NGOs, primarily in the United States, but also more generally, to point out that ILGA ILGA is a network of several hundred NGOs. It included within its membership a group called the North American Man-Boy Love Association, a group that promoted pedophilia. This, of course, was a huge no-no in a country like the United States. And these Christian right groups, in coordination internationally, got very powerful senators in the US Congress to point this out. They made speeches about it. They threatened to take away US funding for the United Nations unless ILGA was suspended. And what happened initially was that ILGA was suspended from the UN in 1994. And then even more interestingly, at least from my standpoint, ILGA actually changed the structure of its network in response to these attacks by the other side. Namely, they expelled NAMBLA. So this effort at preventing participation by one side succeeded in expelling the group and also in that network changing its very structure. Now, by the late 90s, ILGA did reapply, and in 2000, there we go. In 2006, ILGA Europe was readmitted. But for a period of 12 years, it was kept out of that conversation at the United Nations. So in many ways, kind of a victory for the anti-LGBT rights agenda. Now, as I said, this effort to prevent participation by one side at the UN is not just done by these conservative groups. Another example that I talk about in the book is the effort by the left, with the pro-LGBT rights agenda, human rights groups generally, to expel the Holy See from its status at the UN. There was actually a very public campaign led by a group called Sea Change, which had as its major goal to kick the Holy See out of essentially this quasi-state status, where it has a great deal of power at the UN. Now that effort went on for a number of years. Ultimately, it failed. But the important thing from my standpoint is that what you see is that ideologically opposed networks working at the UN for completely contrary goals start the fight, if you will, over the most basic thing. Who's going to be allowed to even be at the table to discuss these sorts of issues? So I think the literature has generally not even looked at this issue, but it's a very important aspect of what goes on in many of these kinds of conflicts. So moving from participation, let's look at the claims that these two sides made on these issues. Now, it might seem unsurprising that they would have contrary claims about different types of issues, but it's worth going to some depth about this to see how this actually works, I think. So to start with the LGBT rights groups, they have made given a variety of types of evidence to support their claim that LGBT rights should become part of international law. But one of the most basic ones is evidence that they take from scientific bodies, such as the American Psychological Association, which claims that, today anyway, claims, this is somewhat of a new development, but claims that sexual orientation is a valid biological and psychological concept, and therefore should be part of UN law. There's a scientific basis for doing the kinds of political activism that they are doing. Now, we may all accept that science, but the other side does not. And the Pope, for instance, in the Catholic Church hierarchy at least, has suggested that this is the whole idea of sexual orientation is an incoherent idea. It doesn't make sense according to this concept. They don't even turn to science as such. And similarly, people like Putin will just dismiss the science completely and argue that this is, not a matter of science, or they will actually bring in contrary scientific studies which suggest that sexual orientation is not what the American Psychological Association says it is. And they'll have their own set of other certifying authorities who will make this claim. Now, again, many of us, I think, would dismiss those ideas as unscientific, but they will either say, this is, a moral issue, or that there actually is contrary science about this. Similarly, with regard to same-sex marriage, the claim is that this is a basic human right. And often this is made through that grafting process or mechanism I talked about before. We have accepted marriage between men and women. This is we can graft onto that the idea that two people who love each other, whatever their sexual orientation is, should be able to marry one another. And therefore, it is a human right to be able to do that. For better or for worse, though, the other side will say, no, this is not a human right. And in fact, it's much worse than that. There's a whole range of some of these conservative groups who will claim that if we start to promote same-sex marriage, we're going to see populations crash, and that there's kind of they use the term demographic winter. It's a threat to civilization itself if we permit this, and it can't be a human right. So again, I think many of us would dismiss this claim, but it has, for better or for worse, gotten a significant amount of traction among those who are sort of conservative religious believers. So the claims of the LGBT rights activists are attacked through a variety of mechanisms. The same thing is, of course, done by the other side. Often, the main basis on which the anti-LGBT activist groups will make their claims is that there are established religious values out there, traditional values, that say that the natural family, for instance, is one man and one woman. And that this is something that all human traditions, and religious traditions in particular, have seen as basic since time immemorial. That, of course, doesn't cut much ice for the progressive groups and LGBT rights groups. And instead, they will say that we have evolving values and morality in our modern world. We're not these traditional societies anymore. We need to evolve and change. And one interesting thing that they have done beyond just stating that is that they are trying to undermine the religious claims of the traditionalists themselves. For instance, this organization, the Arcus Foundation, which is a very important funder of LGBT rights issues in the US and worldwide, has created a program on religion and values whose goals are, quote, achieving a long-term change in religious institutions towards accepting LGBT issues. In other words, they are trying not only to attack this established religious ideology, but actually to change that ideology internally. Again, I don't think they've been all that successful, especially with the most sort of rabidly anti-gay groups out there. But from the theoretical standpoint, the IR theory standpoint, I think the key thing is to note this logic of conflict. there's nothing like the idea of what's appropriate doesn't really work between these two networks. They just utterly reject what the other side says is appropriate. They see it as totally inappropriate. And so it's all about the conflict between the sides. One final area I'll go into on this clashing UN activism has to do with the process by which these activist groups work at the UN. One of the most important developments that gay rights groups tried to promote over many years was to incrementally advance new LGBT rights norms through actions that were taking place at very low level UN agencies or bodies that most states weren't paying much attention to. For instance, declarations or rulings or interpretations at maybe the Human Rights Commission, someplace like that, or maybe a statement made at a particular treaty body that was not all that well followed. So there were, and in the book I actually quote one of the activist groups about using what they called this kind of stealth policy to increase the acceptance of these norms by making these very small-scale incremental steps in low-level UN bodies. But there was also a much more public effort that took place in the mid-2000s to create a new set of principles that would arguably, which would argue that LGBT rights were not only something that we should have in international law, but actually something that we already have if we interpret existing international law correctly. And this came to be known as the Jakarta Principles. These were years of negotiations, basically only among the progressive activists, but there were years of negotiations that were culminated in a meeting in Jakarta, Indonesia, and these principles were published. And they did indeed hold that existing international law, even though it never mentioned homosexuality or LGBT rights or anything like that, even though it did not mention that it actually already accepted LGBT rights at the international level based on the way in which interpretations had been done at these lower level bodies or just extrapolations from existing law. Now, that was celebrated by the LGBT rights community, absolutely. Jakarta Principles were seen as a major new development, but maybe unsurprisingly, the anti-LGBT rights groups, in particular this one CFAM, which is based in New York and works exclusively at the UN, Catholic Family and Human Rights Institute, but others as well, have argued that the Jakarta Principles are meaningless. They are simply the statements of activists on the other side about something that they wish were true, but which is not actually accepted in international law. And they've also actually written a book about, or a pamphlet about this called Rights by Stealth, where they quote the other side as talking about this incremental policy and say that this is, again, an illegitimate way of creating new international law. And they're arguing essentially that only states, by creating new conventions, can actually change what international law is. So again, conflict on that issue. The Jakarta Principles claim that it's clear idea that there's an international norm, an international law that promotes or supports human LGBT rights, that it's binding on all states. That's actually in the Jakarta Principles. But in addition to questioning that principle, as I just mentioned, these conservative groups have tried to create their own contrary international norms, doing kind of a mirror image of what was done at the Jakarta process, This occurred again during the mid-2000s in Doha, Qatar, and included right-wing conservative religious activists from across the world who came to Doha and worked again for many years to create what they have their own institute, the Doha International Family Institute, and the Doha Principles, which are their own ideas about what the natural family is. They base it on international law, because there actually are provisions in the ICCPR that talk about what the family is, and this was written back in the 50s or so, and it talks about one man and one woman. So they reference that. And again, more importantly, I guess from my standpoint, the strategy of these groups is exemplified in this quote from the first director of the Doha International Family Institute. Interestingly, he's not Muslim, he's Mormon. He used to teach at Brigham Young University. He's part of that batista-burqa coalition. So what he says is that international norms actually are important. They shape the content of domestic law. And how can our side avoid negative outcomes? Well, the way we can do that is by promoting our own contrary international norms through the Doha process, for instance. So that if international lawyers go out there and say, oh, look, the Jakarta Principles say that international law already recognizes LGBT rights, then we can come back and say, oh, look, the Doha Declaration says just the opposite, that there are no LGBT rights and that sexual orientation and gender identity don't even exist. So these activists are basically taking a leaf from the progressive group's book and doing exactly the same thing, just in the exact opposite direction. So I hope you can see that I've, that this is something, the conflict is just completely fundamental to the politics of this. You can't really talk about logics of appropriateness unless you can find your vision only to one side, which scholars have mostly done, confining their vision to the left. You could probably do the same thing from the right, but not many people have done that. And my book looks at both sides of this. Okay, so I want to just extrapolate a little bit here. It's not only in gay rights issues that this occurs. It's in all manner of other types of issues. For instance, as I'm sure many of you are aware, issues like abortion rights or contraception rights. Maybe you're not so aware of this, but homeschooling is a major issue. Okay, good. Okay, major issue. I wasn't aware of it when I started out in this either, but it's a major issue and debate on these issues. And both left and right are fighting it out on these rights issues. Environmental issues. I think we also are quite aware of the fact on all manner of issues, from rainforest protection to climate change, that it's not just left-wing environmental groups that are out there, but a whole range of often corporate-supported, sometimes free market groups that are saying, there are no rights for the environment. It's all about the rights of people. And then one final issue, which I actually did research on for this book in Brazil, the last time I was here in 2008, I believe, are security issues, as I'll call them. The United Nations, for much of the 1990s and early 2000s, was debating whether to put international controls on the sale of private arms, of guns to people. They focused on the illicit sale of arms. And groups like Oxfam and Human Rights Watch got very involved in trying to promote the idea that we needed to have an international convention to prevent the illicit sale of small arms. They formed their own network, including IANSA, I won't go into the abbreviation there, and Control Arms, another part of this, a later version of IANSA. These are groups that were promoting the idea that we needed to end the illicit sale of arms at the UN. And they used some very dramatic framing mechanisms, as you can see there. But maybe again, unsurprisingly to those of us in this room now, they faced really, really strong opposition at the UN from day one, not just from the National Rifle Association, which many of you I'm sure have heard of in the United States, a very powerful lobbying group, but also from a whole array of national level groups who promote gun rights or promote sport shooting or one or another, various things. If you're a gun nut, like in Canada, you're part of one of these groups. And they formed an international network to fight against control arms, to fight against IANSA. And they got consultative status at the UN, and they fought the UN basically to a standstill, so that there is no policy that's been adopted on this issue as international law. Again, it's kind of a zombie policy that's been created there. It's pretty empty in terms of controlling gun sales. Anyway, so there was an international network, but why was I in Brazil? Well, because that international network was very closely tied to the Brazilian pro-gun network. And this was way before Bolsonaro's presidency, of course. I was doing the research in 2008. It was shortly after the referendum in 2005. But as I'm sure many of you know, this effort to control the sale of arms, private sale of arms here in Brazil, goes back to the early 1990s. And as it became more and more threatening to Brazilian gun owners, they reached out internationally to the National Rifle Association, to some of these Canadian groups, and to that international network for support to try to, especially in 2005, to try to have their side win the referendum. And these international groups were happy to provide support. Just as, by the way, the groups promoting the referendum were also very happy to take support from the UN, the networks that were working at the UN, from the UN itself, and from individual NGOs. So the Brazilian gun referendum, which I write about in a whole chapter in the book, presents an instance in which both sides are, first of all, reaching out for international support. Both sides are winning international support and are sharing strategies among these activist groups on their side of this debate, sharing ways to try to win this referendum. They're learning from one another. People who were part of this pro-gun movement here in Brazil actually went up to Washington, visited the NRA, and followed some of the exact same strategies that the NRA had used in various states to try to defeat certain of these kinds of referendums. For instance, in California, there was a very similar one in the early 90s. And one of the most striking things I found, and I interviewed people here in Brazil on both sides of this issue, and I learned in talking with the pro-gun groups that they literally took advertisements that the NRA had used in the United States, changed a few words, put it into Portuguese, and then used it in the referendum. So they weren't just learning, they were deliberately taking, and these American groups were really happy to give this sort of support. And why was that? It wasn't just because they were sort of thinking, we need to help these Brazilians, they can't help themselves. They saw Brazil as a critical example for the US. And so they brought back the win that these pro-gun groups had here in Brazil. They brought it back to the United States and made a huge thing out of it, saying, if Brazil is not going to ban the private sale of arms, then the United States certainly shouldn't do it either. And they brought back some of the leaders of the pro-gun movement here in Brazil to speak at the NRA convention and to, really give hope to American gun owners that, they are not alone in the world. So it's not like a one-way street in which the North helps the South. The South is helping the North very much as well, if you get into this, on both sides of these issues. Well, for the pro-control, gun control groups, they tried to sort of bury the result in Brazil because they had very much expected that this would succeed in Brazil and that it would act as an example for the rest of the world. In fact, it was a bad example for them. It was a good example for the pro-gun groups. I can talk more about that. It's a really fascinating case. I really enjoyed my research here, as well as just being here back in 2008. But anyway, to conclude, I think we need to, in some ways this has already been done because this book is a little, as I say, it's 2012 was published, but I think we still need a lot more focus on the ways in which different activist groups react to one another. And that a lot of their activism is really a response to that of their foes. We need much more focus, not just on those very sort of positive sounding things like persuasion or framing. We need to focus more on the ways in which both sides in any kind of these conflicts tries to block the other side, to tar them, to blacken their names, to delegitimate them. And that is really critical to understanding why often international activism doesn't work. We might want it to work, but it often doesn't work despite efforts at persuasion, at shaming and framing. It's very hard. You're facing very, very powerful opponents who are using all sorts of nasty tactics against your side, and your side will use similar tactics against them, as I've tried to show. I think as well, we need to understand that these different networks really affect one another in profound ways. I mean, one of the more interesting ways that I noticed, I haven't talked about it yet, is that the two sides will spy on one another. They will become parts of one another's networks, sort of in a underhanded way. They won't say they're part of it. They'll just, get the email that is coming through to the members of that network, so they know what the other side is doing. But more importantly, they will try to reshape the identity of the other side and force it to change its strategy. And I showed how that happened a few minutes ago. They'll often as well look to what happens in one faraway country, like for the US, look at Brazil, and say, look at our victory, look how we should take heart from that. We can bring that home and use it for ourselves. Or sometimes as well, they'll just point to another country's as a kind of a horror story of what could happen if we don't organize. And so the policies, for better or for worse, for those of us who want to see new human rights norms develop, often are non-policy. At least if you're looking at international law. International norms, as I said, they're very, very squishy. It's very hard to know when you've got truly a new international norm or whether it's just a bunch of rival norms that are pretty meaningless. But sometimes we do also get this kind of zombie policy, which is pretty meaningless, which I think we had in the case of both of these cases, but especially in terms of the UN efforts to control arms. So final conclusions, global civil society, a term which I guess we don't hear that much anymore, but has been talked about extensively in the past, is really, I think, a misnomer. When we look at NGOs or activist groups, they are ideologically torn, extremely conflicted. There's nothing really civil about them. They're often uncivil to one another. Even if they're not violent, they're using everything up to violence to try to undermine the other side. And the final upshot is that international law is highly contested and in many ways kind of indeterminate. We may believe that once you have a new international law in place, that's never going to change. My argument would be that actually it can change, and therefore we have to defend international laws that we like all the time, because there can be campaigns that will undermine them. This is true, of course, at the domestic level as well, and I'm sure many of you are aware of the fall of Roe v. Wade, the abortion decision in the United States, just, was it last year or 2 years ago now, after, 50 years on the books. It's even more these kinds of laws, even laws, are even more threatened at the international level. But if you're focusing on global norms, again, these are so sort of, I'd say, airy-fairy. They're very, very difficult to grasp hold of. That it's really hard to just even know when a norm has actually developed or become globalized. And I would argue that the literature should move away from focusing on norms because they are so ethereal and so airy, and should focus much more on international law as well as on the conflict over international law. So I'll leave it at that and happily take your questions.
Thank you so much, Cliff, for
Sure.
for your talk and these interesting points about how these groups try to undermine one another. We have time for collecting questions from the audience. So if anyone wants to go first, Monica?
Thank you so much for that.
Sure.
My question pertains perhaps to something you did not say, but I wonder if you have thoughts on it. I mean, these anti-rights, specifically anti-LGBT rights groups, of course, they have a specific focus. Let's say the so-called natural family, but at some point in the 2000s, my perception is that these groups started to become attached in a wider way, that the networks started to change, and that I'm working on the far right, so I'm interested in how the far right, with a much more sort of global vision of
Right.
how societies should be organized that include anti-LGBT rights. I would actually say that this is quite core to their growth and their movement. So this is what I'm trying to understand. How do these specific anti-right groups gather and make these alliances and connections with actually far-right, not only parties, but movements and of course transnationalized. I'm interested in specifically in how they're being transnationalized in Latin America. So I think what you're working on is super, super connected. I was actually talking to a friend today in Turkey, and I mentioned that I was coming to your talk, and she was saying how in Turkey, though there is a very, very small LGBT rights movement, the
Right.
government is able to securitize the issue and treat it as a threat to the
Sure.
natural traditional family, picking from the international scenery. And looking at other places, and because really these connections, and of course, after the internet became such a crucial part of our lives, it became much easier to make the connections, right?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Just jumping quickly on this, I was, also wanting to hear more about whether there are new contours to this strength bedfellow connection, right? Because it has become broader in a way. At the same time, they continue to replicate the same strategies. I mean, looking at the Doha principles, you said, I immediately connected with the GVA consensus, the Geneva consensus, which is also, the same strategy of creating another normative frame. So has the anti-rights movement became just more amplified, or has it also become more sophisticated and organized? How do you see this developing since you published this book in 2012, 10 years on, and how much have they have learned and sophisticated their
Right.
actions?
the two of you spoke about an amplified movement, but my question goes on where those groups are focusing right now, because looking at the extreme right, both in Brazil and in the US, I get the feeling that they are starting to focus really heavily on trans issues specifically, and a lot of the presentation was about gay and lesbian rights, like gay marriage, sexuality in general, and not so much gender identity. So I want to know if I'm correct in thinking that it feels like trans issues have become this symbol, this thing where everyone focuses on because it's the thing that is least accepted by society, so it's easier to attack it. And in this dynamic of conflict between anti-LGBT groups and pro-LGBT groups, if we are losing ground, like because trans issues seems to be really powerful attacks by the right, and I wonder if the left is responding in kind.
Yeah, so my question is a little in the same vein. I was also thinking in terms of how, 5 years ago, a lot of people in the LGBTQ movement were thinking that the real rights struggle is no longer for lesbians, gays, and bisexuals. It is for trans people. Today we find ourselves in a very different situation where the rollback of trans rights has really definitively impacted everyone in the community. My question is more of, within that vein and how we've seen it change, we have also seen an unprecedented generational shift in how different age groups view LGBTQ issues. That's true here in Brazil, it's true very true in the United States. So I was wondering if you could speak to how that generational divide may be playing out on an international scale.
That's interesting.
We can go back to you and then collect more questions.
Okay. Yeah, that generational question, I'm scratching my head about that. That's a really interesting idea. I have to, I don't have any knowledge other than, agreeing with what you say that there is clearly a generational divide, especially I think on the trans issue in the US. I'm not as sure about here. How that's played out in terms of activism, I really don't know. But it's a very interesting thing to look at, I'd say. Let's see. Well, let me stick with trans rights for a second. I agree, as you were saying, that this has become a major focus, especially, well, again, I'm most familiar with the US. It has become the dominant issue in this area of LGBT rights at the moment. I think you are absolutely right that each side will look for a weakness on the other side to exploit. And so to the extent that this is the least accepted currently in our society, it is one that the right-wing groups will go to town on because they will sense a weakness, try to exploit that, and maybe, I'm not sure how far they want to go on this actually. I mean, there are some, let's say in the United States, who might want to roll back same-sex marriage, but there are many others who would not go that far. They would accept that that is now our law, but they are sort of drawing the line at certain aspects of the trans rights agenda. Not all aspects, I think. And this is very much a generalization, of course. You've got, on one hand, the sort of the Christian right groups who are going to be completely opposed to any aspect of trans rights. But then you'll have others who will just say, we should not have trans women competing in women's sports, and that's actually a women's rights issue. Actually, we were talking about this over coffee a few minutes ago. I wrote another book after this one called Rights as Weapons, and this was published in 2019. So kind of before the major focus on trans rights, I'd say, but there already was much more than 10, 15 years ago. And I have a chapter about the conflict over trans rights. And it's not framed as right versus left though, because as I'm sure many of you are aware, there are people who consider themselves staunch feminists who object to certain aspects of the trans agenda. They may not object to the idea that adults can do whatever they want with their body and whatever they want with their identity, but they object to other aspects of it. In fact, I lead off the chapter talking about the British Labour Party, which maybe you know about this issue. They had a quota for women in the party, in party leadership roles, and that was hard fought. Women fought a long time to get a quota for a certain number of seats or positions that would be set aside just for women. And then as the trans agenda progresses, they find that trans women are taking up those positions, and many of the women who fought for this objected to that in turn. That's kind of how I lead off the chapter. And it looks at the conflict, but it's not on a left-right dichotomy necessarily. It goes beyond that. Anyway, I think this, at the international level, I'm not as sure. I haven't actually been following these issues as much as I used to at the international level. For sure, though, the concept of sexual orientation and gender identity is very strongly debated at the UN to this day. And often, again referring to one of the points I made before, often these conservative networks will point to what's they say has happened in Europe, Western Europe, or the United States as a horror story that the rest of the world wants to avoid, and they work very closely. Activist groups, maybe from the U.S. or Europe, who are against the soggy concept. They work very closely with diplomats from conservative African countries in particular, and Muslim countries such as Uganda would be a good example. And I do know that certainly over the last few months there have been lots of debates, lots of efforts to prevent even what might seem very innocuous developments from taking place in this sexual orientation and gender identity realm, because these activist groups and states see it as the opening wedge to a much broader view of trans rights, and one that would lead to what they see as these horror stories occurring in places like the United States. And of course, again, I think in a less direct way on trans rights, but people like Putin, who's now in Russia, who are very much part of this, have been pointing to that as well, as a threat to civil. He's really used that term, a threat to civilization himself. Mm-hmm. Okay, so going back to Monica's question and Paula's questions, these are really important issues. And when I wrote this book and it was researching it in particular in 2000, maybe 2005 to 8 or something like that, there really wasn't this sort of populist right-wing internationalism that we see today, I think. I mean, that developed much more, I'd say, in the 2010s. And it to some extent, it did bring in these groups on, especially the LGBT issue, to a smaller extent, some of these gun issues. But, I myself am not sure how, whether this was sort of like a bottom-up phenomenon in which these activist groups in these particular narrow issue areas got together to support, say, populist, I don't really like that term, but I'll use it here, maybe nationalist politicians in various states. I don't think that's what happened. That's not based on my research, though. My sense much more is that this was something, again, happening primarily at the national level, in which certain wings of conservative parties within many states felt that maybe we could call them free market conservatives or neoliberal conservatives were not promoting a social conservative agenda. And that left an opening for politicians to promote that kind of social conservative, or in some cases, anti-neoliberal agenda. So I'll just use Trump as an example. I mean, his main focuses initially were, well, issues like immigration, trying to prevent large-scale immigration, which both Democrats and mainstream Republicans had been promoting for many years. He also was extremely against free trade, which of course was a conservative, mainstream conservative Republican issue. That's why the Bush Republicans absolutely detested him. And he also took up the social conservative agenda, which again, a lot of the free market conservatives by the 2015-16, they kind of accepted the idea that, freedom of various forms of free expression might include sexual rights. But it's these socially conservative groups that were not being represented sufficiently by the pre-existing conservative groups, so it gave an opening for populist politicians like Trump to come into office. Again, I don't know enough about Brazil, but my sense was the gun issue is really crucial here for Bolsonaro's rise as well. If we, it's not really exactly a party, but the British vote to leave the European Union was another example of this. Once these powerful politicians or political movements were established, I think that some of these smaller scale activist groups probably then joined with them and tried to, use what they did to try to expand their influence. But I can't make that as a definitive statement. I actually have thought about rewriting this book or adding a chapter to this book about precisely what you're talking about. Some people would call the nationalist international. These groups that are, nationalist groups within their own countries, but are all doing the same, seeking the same sorts of things, and are to some extent working together. I'm sure many of you have heard of Steve Bannon. And he was trying to create this actually in Europe and with Trump. That seems to have failed. But still, there are a lot of connections between these groups. And Bolsonaro, I guess he's now in the United States, probably plotting these sorts of things. This. I guess that's the most I can, I think, offer about this. I think there are, as you were saying, Paul, there are definitely some new contours. I think that these groups were actually very sophisticated to begin with, at least as long as I was doing research on them, they were extremely sophisticated. Some of them were led by some of the most talented lawyers in the United States. One of the cases I look at in Sweden, where there was a Pentecostal preacher who gave this very nasty anti-gay sermon and was prosecuted by the Swedish government for hate speech and was sentenced to 30 days in jail and threatened with another 6 months in jail for this sermon from the pulpit. To his rescue came these very, very talented American lawyers, including people who have argued at the US Supreme Court. They came to Sweden. They gave support at the Swedish Supreme Court. Ultimately, using European human rights law, they got his conviction overturned. And so these people, this was back in 2005, I think. These people were extremely sophisticated to begin with, and I'm sure they continue to be. I mean, both sides are sophisticated, and they learn from one another, they use tactics from one another. It's fascinating once you get into the detail about how these groups actually work with one another. Actually, one other anecdote I'll just mention as I was talking about this Swedish case. Once that Swedish pastor was, his guilty verdict was overturned at the Supreme Court of Sweden, those American groups turned him into a hero for the anti-gay rights agenda, such that they actually brought him back to the United States. He toured around the country. He couldn't even speak English, but he toured around trying to promote the idea that if we have gay rights in the United States, then free speech will be undermined and threatened. And he pointed to himself as an exemplar of what would happen if the right wing didn't work against this.
Thank you, Professor, for your amazing presentation and research. I would like to make a question, but first I'd like to add that in our case, Bolsonaro instrumentalized immigration, referring to the Venezuelan flow, because we're receiving a lot of Venezuelan immigrants. The peak has passed, but there was this trying to convince people that if Lula won, Brazil would turn into a communist country as Venezuela did. So this was the story that was going on, right? Very intimately related to immigration.
Very
interesting. But my question is, what is the thought or the point of view behind calling zombie activism or zombie politics? Because it seems like if you depart from the framework that you're calling progressive politics, good politics, I know that you're actually against that, but if you depart from that point of view, it seems like zombie politics is always trying to deviate from the issue or delegitimate the good issues. But I'm not sure if it's like that or how we could see the other side as also building stuff.
Okay, good question.
More question? You have other questions? No? Sorry.
Okay. Well, first of all, I was quite interested about that anecdote about Bolsonaro instrumentalizing immigration, and I'm just curious: were most of those immigrants those sort of wealthy conservative people, or are these just people who were harmed by the Venezuelan
People who are harmed by the Venezuelan
economic problems?
Yes,
Okay, I see. Yeah. Okay, that's very interesting. So that's another parallel with the U.S. and the way in which Trump used immigration. Well, yeah, and you make a good point about my use of the word zombie policy. I mean, I am trying to get away from this normative attachment to one or another side. I mean, as you could hear, probably, although I do have my own personal views about this, in doing the research, I try to be totally objective, so I look at both sides equally, and I don't want to call one progressive and the other regressive, because those have connotations that don't, necessarily aren't necessarily good ones or helpful ones in analysis. But also, I think it's important as scholars to have a point of view, but a political point of view, but to maybe confine it to politics rather than to your scholarship. I know that's hard, even for myself. A lot of my research I was kind of plugging my nose while I was interviewing people, gun rights groups here to some extent, and the anti-LGBT rights groups too. But I felt I had to do it to understand the politics and also to really help the side I believe in. I feel that you actually have to know what's really happening rather than what we wish might happen. And so the terms I have used mostly in this book were rival networks. I try to avoid left and right even, just talk about rival, although I do use Global Right Wing in the title to try to sell some books. But I think the idea that these groups are rivals to one another is a way of showing, first of all, that you're not taking sides. You're not saying one side is good, one side's bad. and you're not saying one side got there first and the other was a response, because it's really hard to figure out which group was there first. And frankly, a lot of the groups on the right, traditional values, were there before the left-wing groups. But the term zombie policy, you're right, it does have kind of a negative connotation. But I would apply it to some sort of right wing. You know, if the right wing was trying to do something that was hollowed out by the left, they weren't able to achieve everything that they wanted to do, I would equally apply it to that policy. The whole point of that term is just to sort of in a dramatic way suggest that even though something was accomplished, it wasn't very meaningful. It's like I said, a kind of a living dead sort of thing. And like the case of the UN on small arms control, the policies that were finally established after many, many years of conflict between the two sides were so weak that even Human Rights Watch, which had been trying for years to promote them, called them meaningless. There's a quote I use in this book that they literally say that this is a policy that is so meaningless, we're not going to work on this anymore. So that's the main reason I use that term. Maybe it's not the best, but sometimes you have to use these sort of dramatic terms to make life more interesting. So that's what I did.
Do we have more questions? No? Okay, so I think we can finish by thanking Professor Clifford Bob for joining us today and sharing the results of your research. And we're looking forward to continuing the conversations with you. Professor Clifford Bob is staying here until late July, so he'll be around.
Yeah, and I would just encourage, if anyone has a another question, please send it to me. I have a very simple email address. It's bob@duq.edu. So, or you can get it from Paula. And just one other thing, I'm actually, as I suggested, not really doing research on this area anymore. I'm here on a Fulbright grant, and I'm doing research about various aspects of the response, social movement response to COVID policies. If anyone has any leads of NGOs to get in touch with, please let me know. The other thing I'm very interested in, and it's related to this, is the efforts to control disinformation here in Brazil, and which is happening in the United States too. And the Bill 2360, which I guess you may be aware of, to try, I think it's nicknamed the fake news bill, which I believe the Brazilian Senate has passed, but still being debated in Congress, and Lula government is supporting it. Anyway, I'm very interested in that bill and the debate about it. I know that there are a lot of conservative and evangelical congresspeople who are against it. If anyone knows of any non-conservative groups that might be against it, for instance, in the United States, we have groups that are purely defenders of free speech. They will defend the right of a conservative or a liberal to say something. If any of you can think of any NGOs here, or anyone here who has that sort of focus on the principle of free expression, I'd be very interested in knowing who that is. The one person I know who's here is Glenn Greenwald, but of course he's an American, and he has that kind of perspective. But I would think there would be such groups, but in any event, I'll probably try to interview some of the conservative legislators themselves, but I want to also try NGOs, so let me know.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.